Even though these days I gravitate more towards computer gaming, there was a time where the best video games on the market, or at least my favorite, belonged on the Nintendo. There was one game in particular that I go back to when I think about those days. Startropics. Startropics goes down in the books as one of the most unused intellectual properties that Nintendo still owns. We got Startropics and then Startropics 2 towards the end of the NES lifecycle, and that's it, there hasn't been a game since. And one of the things that sticks out about these two games is they did a good job of taking the player to exotic locations and really showing off what the Nintendo could do, especially the first game. There wasn't a whole lot to the story. The character you played at was more of a, I'd say a vicarious insert for Nintendo gamers of the time. The hero, Mike, is what Nintendo thought of their Western audiences. So, that being said, the plot of Startropics would be to take the player and bring them to exotic tropical locations like the beach. And I can't quite put it to words, but there's something about the world building that really captured my imagination as a kid. Especially this little part of the map screen on the second level. The location you're supposed to visit, the people you're supposed to meet, and the caves you're supposed to defeat are all located to the right. However, the left portion of the screen is completely open for the player to just sail and sail and sail into. Rather than put up an invisible barrier, they designed it so that if you went off the left-hand side of the screen, it would wrap you around just so that it would look like you continued to sail into the wide ocean blue. However, no matter how long you did this, if you turned around and went back towards the right, there would be the level, thus keeping the player in bounds without having to hit one of those invisible walls. I don't quite know why this captured my imagination so much, but I remember staring at the screen for like 10 minutes as a kid, just sailing into the ocean blue. It's little details like that that help make the game come alive for me a little bit more than most games. Here's another really cool detail that shows up early in the game, and I've seen this footage show up in a lot of other Startropics videos, so I thought I'd take some time to explain it. There's a section in the first dungeon where if you move to the right, you can collect some red medicine that'll restore your health whenever you decide to use it. There's a trigger that shows an identical room just above it with a second piece of red medicine. And then in that room there's a trigger that opens a door that you would think would lead to a third bottle of red medicine, but no, it takes you to instant death. Even as a kid, when I saw this, it was immediately apparent what the developers were trying to communicate with this. It was a greed trap, and I loved it. It's an interesting way for a designer to speak to a player. I see a lot of people cite this as an example of unfair level design, but I never saw it that way. Also, I think it's worth noting that this game had a little bit more at stake when you die than most games. Mike actually dies when you die. Yeah, you probably wouldn't see that today. There's one more thing about the first game I haven't seen mentioned in other videos on the subject. The ending of the game is probably the best and most detailed ending I've ever seen to an NES game. The player, although I won't spoil it here, is treated to close-up artwork renditions of things that happen throughout the adventure. It's really detailed and really satisfying. Even though the difficulty of getting to the ending was unbelievable, this is one instance for the Nintendo where it really paid off, and it sticks out among other games like Ghosts and Goblins, where the journey is incredibly difficult and you get to the end and it's not satisfying. Startropics really did it right in terms of the ending. If you haven't seen it, I suggest going back to play through it, or at least looking it up on YouTube. It's really cool to watch. I did mention there was a sequel, Zoda's Revenge Startropics 2, but there were problems with the gameplay and I couldn't really get very far in this, although it looked like it had all of the first game's ability to take the player to exotic locations, even more so due to this silly time travel plot. Some of the map screens look really cool, although I had to look them up on YouTube to get a good look. There was a sweet spot that I think would have been perfect for Startropics 3 to come out, and that was 1996 to 2000. These 4 years was the time when early 3D graphics were really what was popular in the industry. And you could see scary games that had more of a horror theme, which still managed to be lighthearted in tone. One perfect example is Medieval. If you look at Medieval for the original PS1, horror-themed game, right? You got graveyards, you got skeletons and all that. but it's still very lighthearted and doesn't take itself too seriously. I think this would have been perfect to roll out Startropics 3. They could have really played up the graveyard aspect and had Mike walk around in some 3D sort of areas, a lot like, I don't know, Ocarina of Time or Mario 64, but it didn't happen. But if you look at it from another perspective, Super Mario 64 and the Nintendo 64 Zelda games were just a few really good 3D based games from that era, wherein the reality is there were an awful lot of bad ones. So if they did make Startropics 3 during this time, it's a good chance it would have come out like one of the bad ones. Now we're reaching this sort of era where it seems like the popular thing to do is to reboot stuff. Now's the perfect time yet again, especially with the Smash series. This is something that Norm touched on in his Gaming Historian video about Startropics, but I really think he hit the nail on the head. The only problem with putting Mike in Smash is that Mike, again, was a vicarious insert for the player. He didn't have a whole lot to him himself as a character. He was just a guy with a yo-yo, right? I wouldn't lose hope. We had to wait an awful long time for that Xbox 360 game from the Slaughterhouse series. And if that got made, there's always a chance that Startropics could return to Nintendo.